So, hello everybody. This is the start of our environmental health unit, and this is a unit that generally excites me a lot. And what I'm most interested in talking to you about is how human systems, how human society affects the health of the people who live in it. And that's what I mean by environmental health. There are other broader definitions, but I think for this course, a broader definition really dilutes the most important message. So let me first show you what we're going to do in this unit. So here's an overview of the environmental health unit. The first thing is we're just going to discuss what is environmental health. And we're going to look at the kinds of diseases that are caused by the environment, by exposure to toxins in the environment, and why it is difficult to show causation. From there, we're going to go on and we're going to talk for a little bit about how scientists actually study environmental disease. And this is a very exciting part of public health. And after that, we're going to go into why it is a very complex task to understand the effects of exposure to environmental toxins, especially when these are very low-level exposures. So what are the effects of the exposures, these low level of environmental toxins on human health? And then we're going to go through the major kinds of environmental disease in more depth than we did in today's talk. And there's some things I really want you to know about environmental disease. And we're really just skimming the surface, but every day new information comes out about it. Whether it is the information that was released last week about PFAS chemicals, or the front of the Washington Post today about silicosis in China. So that's it. We're only skimming the surface, and I'm hoping it will inspire you to make this a part of your everyday reading when you're looking at the paper, that you'll follow these stories. And finally, we're going to close with a little bit of talk about environmental racism and its connection to health effects. So buckle your seatbelts and let's get going. Okay, so there are two statistics that are commonly used to indicate the general level of human health in a nation. And can you guess what they are? Well, if you said life expectancy, which is how long people are expected to live, the average lifetime, and infant mortality, give yourself a pat on the back, because that's exactly what they are. And what's really amazing about life expectancy is that these statistics vary a huge amount between developed countries and developing countries. So let's take a look at them. Infant mortality, let's start with that. So in a highly developed country with a great healthcare system, such as Japan, we see that about 2.7 infants die in their first year. And that's the definition of infant mortality, death within the first year of life. Out of 1,000 live births. And contrast that with a country like Zambia, which is still a developing country and relatively poor, where the number is 70 per 1,000 live births. So that shows you the range of infant mortality rates in the world. The U.S. infant mortality is about 6.1 per 1,000 live births, and is one of the highest infant mortalities in developed countries. And I'll leave you to perhaps look up what is the cause of the U.S. having such a high rate of infant mortality. Globally, in 2015, there were about 128 million births and about 4.5 million deaths, putting the infant mortality rate somewhere between 32 and 35 per 1,000 live births on average for the whole Earth. And another statistic that you'll often see mentioned is the mortality under 5 years old, which is currently about 45 out of 1,000 globally. So there's a lot of childhood disease, and this infant mortality and childhood mortality rates, they are used as indicators of development and general health in a country. Currently, about 10 million infants and children under 5 die annually around the world, and 99% of these are in developing countries. So infant mortality rate and child mortality rate is used as a general indicator of how good health care is and the level of development in a nation. Life expectancy, let's take a look at that. There's been tremendous improvement in life expectancy in the last century. And let me just show you this statistic just to blow your mind. Currently, every country has a life expectancy greater than the highest life expectancy in 1900. And in 1900, the highest life expectancy was in Belgium, and it was 40 years. So every country in the world currently has a life expectancy higher than that, although some of the African countries are close to 40 years because of HIV/AIDS epidemic. And this has largely been due to the widespread availability of antibiotics. If I had to guess, one reason for it would be antibiotics. But there are other improvements in medicine and public health, and particularly in water systems. And I would also say it's another reason for it is the general rise out of poverty that occurred following national liberation of colonies. And that can't be underestimated as a cause of why people are doing better and living longer. Globally, the life expectancy is now 71.1 years, and it's higher, of course, for females than males, 72 globally for females and 70 for males. The U.S. is interesting because for the last 3 years, life expectancy has declined, and whether that is a real trend or whether it is just stochastic variation, meaning chance variation, I think this represents a leveling off in the United States of the increase in life expectancy, and I think it's due in part to the prevalence of environmental disease, which we're going to be discussing in this unit. So let's first define environmental disease, okay? Think about that for a second. If you want, turn off the video. Environmental disease is caused by physical factors in the environment, and this is contrasted to genetic disease, which is disease caused by issues with our own genome, and infectious disease, which is caused by disease that is some other organism which is caused by disease that is caused by some other organism, such as a virus, which is not an organism, some other agent, I should say, such as a virus or a bacteria. There are many ways to categorize environmental disease, and I'll just show you some of them. You'll hear a lot about lifestyle diseases, which result from people choosing to eat high-fat food or choosing to smoke or choosing to do drugs. And you'll hear a lot about that, especially in the United States. I'll leave you to investigate why that may be. Then you'll see a category of exposure to non-human environmental factors such as UV radiation in sunlight, or a radon radon that occurs in basements. And finally, a third one is environmental disease that is caused due to the exposure of synthetic toxins. So, and I just want to point out here that doesn't mean that the exposure is chronic, is acute toxicity. We're not talking about poisoning here. We're talking about exposure to low levels of toxins that make people chronically, continuously ill. In this course, we're going to be most concerned about number 3 because I think it's probably the issue that's least talked about in day-to-day news, and because I think it's the issue that's least talked about in modern society. So we're going to be focusing on that. For a second, if we contrast health concerns in highly developed countries with those in developing countries, let's look at what those might be. Health is generally good in the highly developed countries. The life expectancy is high. Men at about 75 years, women at about 80 years, women living longer. In the US, the leading causes of disease are cardiovascular disease, cancer, lung disease, and these are caused by lifestyle issues as well as environmental pollutants. And the lifestyle issues are poor diet, as I said, lack of exercise, smoking, obesity. And the environmental pollutants are exposure to chemicals in food, water, and air. So in contrast, in developing countries, the biggest problems have been historically things like malnutrition, unsafe water, which is due to poor sanitation, and endemic diseases such as malaria. And both of these can be exacerbated by poverty. And so they fall more into what I would consider the pertinent areas of environmental disease for our purposes, which are diseases that are made worse by human society or that are entirely caused by the way we organize human society. The life expectancy in developing countries is about 65 years. In the very poorest developing countries, it may be closer to 45 years. And in the last 10 years, in many African nations, it dropped below 40 years, but has now rebounded as more widespread availability of HIV medicine has occurred. Childhood mortality is very high in developing countries, and this is due to things like diarrhea, malnutrition, malaria, and AIDS, HIV, which also has had a big effect on childhood mortality, especially in Africa. Often people in these countries are also exposed to environmental toxins, and often at much higher levels than those people in developing countries. But because mortality is relatively higher in those countries, it may not be noticed. And that indeed is a problem. And we'll see some examples of that. One area that I'm not going to spend any time on, but I thought I should mention, is this idea of emerging diseases and how they're related to globalization, which of course is related to the whole commercialization of the globe, where economies are now interlinked. So, emerging diseases are diseases that have not previously been observed in humans, or it may have previously occurred but is now increasing in prevalence or in geographic range. And let me just give you a few examples of those. One is diseases that have jumped from an animal host. For example, HIV, AIDS. The best guess is it jumped from chimpanzees to humans in about 1908. And contrary to myth, it did not occur because of sex between humans and apes, but rather because of the bushmeat trade, where people who killed primates for the purpose of eating them butchered them and got exposed to simian immunodeficiency virus. So others are moving geographically. West Nile virus, which came to the New World about 25 years ago and spread rapidly around the New World, affects people to some extent, especially older people. Others are becoming more important because of human changes. Lyme disease. My personal belief about Lyme disease is that it's due to the prevalence of deer, and the prevalence of deer are due to the incredible input of nitrogen into the environment through nitrogen fertilizer in crops and gardens. And I'd be happy to talk to you about my hypothesis anytime you'd like. And many are spreading due to travel and commerce, that is globalization, the spread of materials, goods, services around the world. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about invasive species. And while these are all important from a public health point of view, we will not spend very much time on them at all in this course. But if you're interested in this, it's a great thing to be interested in. It's more medical. Public health school may be a place for you to look at after you finish college. So, many pollutants are now ubiquitous, meaning they occur everywhere. And I think the poster child for that is the fact that PCBs are found in measurable levels in Antarctic wildlife, which are the most isolated wildlife in the world. And for those of you who don't know, and probably none of you know, PCBs are synthetic chemicals that were used in electronic products, that were used in hydraulic fluids, that were used as in various plastics, and they have been discovered to have incredibly bad health effects. Many of the pollutants are synthetic chemicals, and that means that they have not occurred in nature before. And you may remember we have discussed that synthetic chemicals should be treated with suspicion, because if nature hasn't seen it, if an organism hasn't seen it, then it just makes it more likely to have an adverse effect in the environment, for example, to accumulate in the environment or to cause novel changes in the environment than things that actually occur in the environment. And I'm not saying that there aren't dangerous chemicals that are natural, but I'm just saying synthetic chemicals need to be treated with suspicion until they're proven to be safe. That is a prudent course of action. There are many pathways for exposure to pollutants, and if you look in this diagram, we may come into contact with the chemical, we may breathe the chemical in, or the pollutant in, the toxin in, or we may ingest it, and it may then come through our digestive system. Those are the three major pathways, and we'll talk a little bit more about them. And the last thing I want to say about pollution and disease is that it is often very difficult to prove the effect of pollutants on people. And we want to look a little bit about why that is. And we'll talk about that as we go on. First, let's look for a second about why there is difficulty in linking pollution to disease. So first of all, there are huge differences in the response of individuals to toxins, right? And this is due to both your genetics and your state of health, and sometimes even to chance aspects of your exposure. So there's a lot of individual variation in humans in their response to a toxin. A second reason that it's difficult to link pollution to disease is that compounds often decompose into unknown compounds with novel effects. In other words, we don't know what these compounds are, we haven't studied them before, and now they have effects that have never been studied, so it's difficult to link pollution to the disease because nothing is known. Third reason that it's difficult to link pollutant exposure to disease is because the response to exposure is often subtle. It might be a change in the immune system or chronic inflammation. In other words, they result in chronic low-level conditions which may have an adverse long-term effect on health instead of acute poisoning. With acute poisoning, you don't feel well and you go to the hospital and you're going to survive or you're going to die, and it's an acute event. A chronic exposure is one where you just have a general bad feeling all the time and you don't really know what it is. That's one aspect of one way a chronic condition may present. Chronic exposure often has a different effect than a single exposure. So in other words, a toxin that you're going to expose to in near lethal levels will affect you one way, but in low levels, it may have an entirely different mode of action on your body. And so once again, we think this as a poison, it acts one way, but in chronic exposure, it acts another way. And as a result, the response to exposure of an environmental toxin is often statistical. There is a percentage of people who are affected, but not everyone is affected. And it reminds me of people who used to say years ago when there was debate about whether or not smoking was dangerous. People would say, my grandma smoked until she was 96 and that didn't kill her, right? But the evidence is overwhelming that smoking shortens your lifespan, and your grandmother was a lucky individual in numerous ways. So I think that gets to some of the reasons why it's very difficult to show that pollutants cause disease. Lastly today, what I want to talk about is what are the common types of environmental disease, and because I think that's important for you to know off the bat, and we'll go into more detail on these later. So one of the most frequently discussed is cancer. Cancer is a frightening disease, and it is, I would dare to venture, mostly caused by exposure to environmental toxins. A second thing is birth defects or developmental defects, defects that occur during your development as a human being, from embryo to free-living infant to an adult. Many toxins act as immune system moderators. They can suppress the immune system, which means you get sick more often, or they can hyperactivate it, which results in inflammation. And we're finding out chronic inflammation is very bad for human beings. They may be endocrine system disruptors. You may remember from biology that the endocrine system are chemical messengers, and which are called hormones, and that hormones act at very low concentrations to send messages from one part of the body. So if a pollutant mimics a hormone or affects the level of a hormone in your body, you can have a lot of health issues that arise from that. Another type of common exposure issue is loss of fertility, and this is often due to endocrine disruption, but could be due to other reasons as well. The loss of fertility, and we will see this when we look at the statistics on global sperm count. And nervous system damage is also another common sign of environmental disease, or another common type of environmental disease. Respiratory diseases are common, especially when the route of exposure is through inhalation. And then chronic intoxication, low-level poisoning, where nothing acute happens, but you just have this chronic exposure, and it may cause problems over the long term, resulting in premature loss of ability or life. And I provided for you here in the PowerPoint a list of environmental diseases compiled by the United States government. So you can look at that if you'd like. So that's it for today. Oh. So I also want to just say, before we sign off today, that the effects of pollution have been demonstrated over and over again. The effects of pollution on human health have been demonstrated over and over again. I'm just going to present 3 or 4 very quickly to you, just to give you the idea of the kinds of effects we've seen. So air pollution, for example, has been shown to trigger heart attacks, to trigger strokes, which is a blood clot in the brain, and irregular heart rhythms. And there's a reference for you. You can check that out if you'd like. In one study, they estimated that about 8 to 9% of the total disease burden in the world may be attributed to pollution, and that it's considerably higher in developing countries than in developed countries. The World Health Organization reported in 2012 that about 7 million people died as a result of exposure to air pollution. That was 1 in 8 global deaths. 40% of the world deaths are caused by air, soil, and water pollution. That was the result of a David Pimentel study at Cornell. So these are the kinds of statistics we're talking about. These are huge numbers, especially when you consider they go on year after year after year, and we have now over 7 billion people in the world. So that's it for today. I hope you have a good idea of what environmental disease is. I hope you understand what the kinds of diseases we're looking at are going to be. And tomorrow we will go on and we will take a look at how one scientifically goes about studying the effects of an environmental toxin on human health. And it's a very difficult task. So until then, study hard.